Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Trade Policy Research Forum webinar for November 2024. We'll get to introducing our panelists in a moment. I just wanted to briefly introduce the forum and tell you what we do. My name is Ben Shepherd. I'm here with my colleague and friend and co-founder, Hannah Norberg. So we started the Trade Policy Research Forum as a pandemic project 4 years ago. And since then, we've been delivering monthly webinars. We use a variety of formats. Our go-to is to try and reproduce the happy feelings that come with doing a lunchtime seminar. That is to say, doing a lunchtime seminar with friends and not the person up the back who asks the really mean questions. So we try to bring research to people outside the main trade policy centres. So we have an audience that goes heavily towards low and middle income countries and people who are relatively at an early stage in their career. So we're very happy to have people from all over the trade policy space. One thing we try to do is to bring together economists, lawyers, political scientists, practitioners, and policy specialists to talk about trade policy, because all of us have different ways of thinking about trade policy, different ways of doing trade policy. And so it's really important to us to try and facilitate those conversations. We also try to bring research into contact with policy, the actual policy making process. And we've got two people today who have got a lot of experience in that sort of world. And I'll hand over to Hannah in a second to introduce them. We're going to be talking about the new American trade policy. There's a lot to talk about. What I would ask audience members to do is that if you have a question or comment, please put it in the chat box or in Zoom's Q&A feature. The speakers may wish to respond to comments on the fly. They're, of course, welcome to do that. Otherwise, Hannah and I will take the questions and comments along with Michael and put them into the Q&A session at the end. If you'd like to follow us, please take a look at our LinkedIn group. We have around 4,000 members. It's a good place to post a paper and get some comments. You'll see a screen at the end of the webinar with a sign up for our mailing list. That's the best way of keeping up to date with what we've got going on. And yeah, we're looking forward to a very informative and engaging session today. So let me hand over to my partner in crime, Hannah, to introduce the speakers.
Thanks so much for that, Ben. Yeah, there is so much talk about the upcoming trade policy, U.S. trade policy. I don't know what to call it, 2.0. I don't know, Trump 2.0. I'm not even going to get into that. But there's a lot of buzz around that. But we are so lucky, Ben, because we get to tap into like the really smart people. And we've been around for a long time, so we know who we really want to get into. So we're super lucky to have Michael Fantino. He is our advisor. Our esteemed advisor, and used to be lead trade economist for the World Bank. And then we have Mary Lovely, who's a senior fellow at Peterson in DC. And we're just thrilled to have you here. And you guys are actually going to run the show. Before we start, though, however, people, there is a lot of people here today. And if there's one thing that is always true at the forum, is that we always run out of time. So please, put your questions and comments in as soon as you have them. And if to warm up, it's nice to use that little chat box and put in where you are coming from today. I'm in Geneva. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Yes. Good morning, Washington time. Good afternoon, good evening, good midnight, where all our TPFers may be today. So this is going to be a sort of informal chat, of course, with your participation. Please text your questions to Ben and Hannah. Mary, I'm going to start with asking about the kind of uncertainty that traders face right now. And I'm hearing this a lot and getting these questions. It's like, because so many scenarios have been spun out. Will everything that was discussed in the campaign be all implemented on January 20th as some sort of shock and awe, or will it be phased in like it was last time? And yeah, is China coming first and then the rest of the world? Is there is there some sort of range of possible rates that there may be? There were certain numbers that were mentioned over the time in the media. If you had to advise somebody, let's say hypothetically, who hasn't yet ordered their usual shipment from China yet, what to think about the range of possibilities? Mary, you're on mute.
Sorry, so bad. Such a newbie mistake. And I just want to say good morning to all the TBFers out there. It's great to have an audience that, looking at the chat box, is coming to us from all over the world. It's a feeling of solidarity for those of us who believe that trade is a boost to prosperity. So it's great to be with you. You asked a lot of questions, Michael, and I'm going to start off by answering the ones I remember, but the ones I don't get to, I hope we'll get to in the conversation. I think a lot of people are expecting President Trump to act in his first year. How fast that will be able to happen, I think, is still very much unknown. When we talk with people close to his inner circle, they're already talking about administrative or executive orders being written already, ready to go. There's a lot of sense that they want to hit the ground running. And there is some belief that President Trump, once he's inaugurated, will be able to draw upon the existing Section 301 authorization to levy tariffs on China fairly quickly. Now, there may be some question as to whether this is in fact an appropriate use of this authority, but we saw President Biden stretch that in unprecedented ways already this year when he used the Section 301 authority to levy 100% tariffs on Chinese EV exports to the United States. So we think that the actions with China will come fairly quickly. Now, will it be what he's been promising, which is a flat 60? In some campaign stops, he even talked about 100% tariffs. I think here's where economic reality, unfortunately, is a great, awakening for folks. That is a lot of, about half of the U.S. imports from China are not taxed at high rates at this point. And key, of course, is electronics and electrical equipment that includes all of your laptop, cell phones. These companies, while they have been making investments in alternative places to do assembly and production, are simply incredibly dependent on China. Dependent is sort of a bad word. It's been a marvelous thing for the US because it has dramatically brought down the price of IT equipment. It has certainly allowed what we now think of as the last industrial revolution as we look ahead to AI. It's clearly been important even in AI because there's a lot of things in these server farms that are powering AI that are not high, particularly at the frontier. I think when the reality of 60% tariffs on those goods hit, we're going to see enormous amounts of lobbying by the companies affected, by consumer groups, by retailers to say, whoa, 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 whoa. So in here, we may, in fact, I think, again, see different tranches, different rates for different types of goods. But that's only a guess because we don't really know. What we do know, I think, for sure, is the direction of travel on China.
Thanks. Okay, so it's actually interesting that you mention lobbying because also, as you mentioned, there was a chunk of Chinese imports, which I make is be about 100 billion, that were never touched by the first term tariffs. And even if tariffs are imposed, there can be an exception, and there are and there are different ways to communicate the administration with the administration. I would love, for example, to know that I was importing something that was on the same list of HS codes as SpaceX or Tesla. Because I would imagine that Elon Musk knows how to get tariff exemptions. When you see people trying to lobby the administration, what are you hearing about that?
Well, there are just so many different issues on which companies would have a stake. So, for example, we have companies that want higher tariffs on everyone because their main competitors come from outside China. There are clearly those who want protection from Chinese imports, but would like to see lower tariffs on the things that they buy. This is, of course, the perennial problem, right? We all like tariffs on the things that we sell because it keeps the price high, but we don't want tariffs on the things that we use in our production process. But of course, we know that there's a dynamic here that keeps the tariff wheel running, which is that once you place tariffs on somebody else's output, that's my input. And so I then lobby for higher tariffs. So there's also a very important cross policy connection to the coming extensions of the first Trump administration's tax cuts. And companies are very eager to see a lower corporate tax rate, other types of tax credits for R&D, expensing equipment, lots of other areas that they see as big ticket items. So how all this cross trading will work out is not clear, except that there will be, to some extent, tax cuts given in exchange for acceptance of higher tariffs. And as you know, Michael, very well, much of what the US imports, and in particular imports from China, are things that US producers use to produce in the United States. So this is not just that we're going to see a higher price on a tablecloth or children's boots. We're going to see higher prices on electric motors and pumps and those cell phones that are coming in for US producers, laptops, et cetera. So we're going to see higher tariffs on lots of things that are used to produce, and that will hurt the competitiveness of US manufacturers. I think we forget a lot of times that the US is the second largest manufactured good exporter in the world. So exports are very important. But they really haven't, interestingly enough, haven't played a big role in the rhetoric around this election.
Right. So it's interesting that you mention the interaction between tariffs and tax policy, because I think this is just starting to come on people's radar, the possibility that they may actually ask Congress to directly legislate some of the tariffs, which hasn't happened since 1930, as I understand, at least not in that way. And that then leads to the question, like, is anybody thinking of this as a revenue tariff? Because even though you can't raise tons of revenue with the tariff, the minute you start thinking of it as a revenue tariff, then that would seem to mitigate rates that are so high that you don't collect any money.
Yeah, my colleagues Kim Klossing and Maury Obstfeld did an entire policy brief on this issue because President Trump himself directly linked the tariff to revenue. So is thinking about it in that sense, as well as a reshoring or bringing manufacturing back to America sense. So that link was clearly made during the campaign. And as you noted, as you raise the tariff, you shrink the base. So at some point, you have a very high tariff and no revenue. And Kim and Maury trace out kind of the Laffer curve for the tariff, looking at and it of course depends on assumptions that you use about how responsive imports are to higher tariffs. It's clear we're well below that level now. But at 60%, we're getting very close to where we're a part of the backward bending curve. The higher we raise it, the less revenue we get. So that link has clearly been made. If we look back in history, and of course, Doug Irwin's book, Clashing Over Commerce, is always the go-to for me on things like this. You know, we see that at the beginning of the last century, so in the early 1900s, the US instituted an income tax, moved away from reliance on the tariff, particularly because forces who were concerned about the regressivity of tariffs. And this is something that Kim Klossing and I have emphasized in our own work, that tariffs will take a heavier burden for poorer households than richer households. And clearly the combination of higher tariffs for income tax cuts will be a reverse Robin Hood. They will take from the poor and give to the rich. So, I mean, this is clear. There's certainly been a lot of press on it. I'm not sure it's well understood by a lot of folks that this is a highly regressive move in terms of fiscal policy for the United States. It was rejected over a century ago precisely because representatives of the working class saw that working people were being taxed on what they bought, but richer people who saved a majority of their income were never taxed on that money. So we got an income tax, and it's kind of in a strange position, you know, over 100 years later, to find ourselves having exactly the same conversation.
Yes, it is. And in these matters, history is very instructive. One of these days we have to get Doug Irwin on here, but we're going to do a pitch for him, even though he's not. Everybody who hasn't read Flashing Over Commerce, go out and read it. Okay. Now, so a lot of the focus has been on China, but then there have been discussions about 10 to 15% on the rest of the world. And there isn't an already existing like authority for every product in every country in the world unless you count the emergency powers. And so I'm wondering how you see the rest of the world playing out.
Yeah, so just looking at it from the US perspective, and of course we might want to talk about how the rest of the world will view this and the probability of retaliation, but just looking at it from the US perspective, I think among those who buy into the view that tariffs can make a country more prosperous, there is the view that these tariffs are necessary because what we learned from the first Trump trade war was that supply chains moved to third countries. So we saw a lot of movement into Vietnam, other parts of East and Southeast Asia, and into Mexico. So if your view is, no, we want to move all that activity back home, you want to forestall those movements into third countries. And in that case, then these 10 to 20% tariffs on the rest of the world become necessary to complete that process. Of course, there's no economic theory which says this makes any sense at all, but there you have it. It is a consistent view. So I think that when you look at it that way, the authority would be sought. Whether it will be received by the executive branch is another thing entirely. Michael, you mentioned the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, IEPA. A lot of people are talking about using IEPA for this. It is something that would clearly be challenged in court. That requires, an immediate threat to the United States, and it seems to me to be quite the stretch to make the case that exports from Japan, UK, Europe are an immediate threat to the United States, and that even a court that wants to provide the widest latitude to the executive might find that a hard pill to swallow. But that's where we are. I think they will make the moves, and we may very well find ourselves in court.
Isn't it the case that IEPA has actually never been used for tariffs? It's been used to like whoop up on like arms smuggling oligarchs and stuff like that.
Yes, I mean we're in unprecedented territory in many in many ways, and this is just another win.
Right. So one of the arguments that people make um, in defense of the current policy is that it will induce a lot of tariff hopping direct investment. And they tell stories about Toyota coming into the United States in the 1980s when Reagan had negotiated the voluntary export curbs. What would you say to people who expect a lot of inbound FDI as a result of the tariffs?
I think we will see some. I mean, we've certainly seen a response from foreign companies to the subsidies that are available under the Chips and Science Act and under the Inflation Reduction Act. There is already some talk in the US about sweetening the pot for investments into the United States. I would not be surprised at all, at least in the short run, to see an increase in these types of flows into the United States in other sectors. So what we're hearing is about industrial policy in other sectors. What the long-term gain to the United States is for this investment is, of course, questionable. But one good aspect would be, in my perspective, it would bring at least competition to domestic producers who would otherwise have a captive market. So in that sense, it does offer some benefits to the US if we're going to have much higher barriers on imports from other countries. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some. Will it be the extent to which the supporters are saying it will happen? I think there we need a little bit of a dose of humility. The US economy is no longer as big as it was. And there's lots of other markets out there. Producing in the United States to sell to those markets is unlikely to be a winning strategy. First, we'll have higher costs on inputs, so it'll be more costly to do business. The US is already a very costly place to do business unless you have highly automated manufacturing processes. And third, something we haven't gotten into yet, is that there's likely to be retaliation against the United States if it undergoes these programs of broad-based tariffs, and that will make it harder for foreign companies operating in the United States to sell their output from the United States to third countries.
So just again, to follow up on something that you just mentioned, what would be the effects of these tariffs on the conditions of competition in the United States? And there might be more competitors if you got inbound FDI. On the other hand, way back in the day, they used to say that the tariff is the mother of trusts. Okay. And so if you exclude a lot of competitors from imports and then get a few more competitors from new investors, at the end of the day, do you actually get more or less competition? My bet would be less.
Well, I think that's a fair comparison. What I was comparing was US barriers without investment versus US barriers with investment.
Okay.
And the investment, we think, would make it better because we'll have more competitors inside this, castle US, right? But clearly, we have seen in the past that you do reduce the number of competitors. And I think it's very dependent on what kind of products. So, for example, in the case that everybody talks about, you referred to with the voluntary export restraints on Japan, there's only a few places in the world that are competitive in autos. And especially at that point with smaller, less gas guzzling vehicles, Japan was a key player and was, as we now know, on the road to become an even stronger and stronger player in auto markets. Of course, the profits that it earned in the US market helped to fund the upmarket move of Japanese competitors into, your Lexus, your Infinities, etc. So I think that is different when we're talking about lower value items where we may not see investment, in which case we just have the loss of competition, the loss of varieties. People forget, perhaps because they're just so used to having a world where we can trade freely with China, that things that are easily discounted by politicians. I'm going to put in a word here. I think that things that women buy for the home or for their family are often denigrated. They're tossed off as things that are bought on Shein or Temu. Yet, clothes for your children, products for your home, these are important purchases for families. And we will see less variety and much higher prices. And that's a loss for households. And I don't think we're going to see a lot of investment in those areas because simply producing them in the United States is not really competitive.
Ben, you've got something.
Yeah, I actually just wanted to chip in. I mean, this has been a great discussion, and Mary, thanks for getting all of the mechanisms into this. I think that's really helpful for our audience to think about. I wanted to take a couple of questions that have come up while you've been speaking in the Q&A and in the chat box, and there are a few that kind of center on this idea of just how far down the road do we think we're going to go with this? I don't just mean in terms of rates, but in terms of breadth and application. So if we think of a tariff being imposed on China, then as you said, the next stage is, well, there might be some deflection and some leakage. So there'll be tariffs on third countries. We've had a question. There have been reports in the press in some parts of the world that there might be tariffs on goods that go through Chinese funded ports, which of course are now quite common in some parts of the world. Then when you were speaking, I thought, my God, in 12 months, are we going to be redoing this session about investment restrictions? Because if we don't want goods coming in from other places, maybe we don't want the factories either. It's a different political dynamic, obviously, because you've got jobs. The jobs play out differently. But I'm just wondering sort of how far we go with that. And, a subsidiary question specifically on Mexico. We saw the free trade agreement renegotiated in the last Trump administration. Is it going to come under pressure in this administration? Because, it's one thing to put a tariff on Vietnam, who I think should be a free trade agreement partner if we'd gone through with TPP. But Mexico actually is. So, that legally and politically, it's much harder to put the tariffs on. But if we do that, we're really upending the whole agreement. So, yeah, again, maybe you can just give us a sense. I know, this is an administration that's particularly hard to forecast over time. So I just ask you to give us a bit of a sense of how far this could go.
Okay, the first part of the question was about investment restrictions. And I think that, the pressure for investment restrictions will come from the national security community, among others. We have seen that with the screening, the revised CFIUS procedure, which is the U.S. procedure for screening inbound investment. That has caught in its net not just investment from China or foreign entities of concern, as we call them now, but also from some of our key allies. We see now with the attempt for Nippon Steel to buy U.S. steel, that investment is likely to be denied. Yet Japan is one of our closest, security and economic partners. So I think that, Ben, you're right to be concerned about investment restrictions. On the other hand, I think President Trump in his first administration showed some flexibility. When jobs are dangled, he tends to change his mind. When people close to him have some important investment stake, he tends to change his mind. We saw him flip-flop on TikTok. And so he's even said on the campaign trail that he'd be open to talk about investment from China in the U.S. auto sector. So I think it's a bit of a wild card, but clearly investment outside of these very sensitive sectors, steel, autos, would be viewed favorably by the administration. So I think that while it's still on a case-by-case basis, we would expect more investment to flow in, at least in the short run. On the issue of USMCA, I think you put your finger exactly on something that is going to be very, very important for the United States and for US businesses, which is what happens with the USMCA review, which is forthcoming. These flows are very large and they're very important to the health of US manufacturers and other companies. They're concentrated in certain sectors, heavily in, I did make a list of these for FTA partners, transport equipment, machinery, electrical, electronics, many of these are producer inputs. These are large flows. It is very unlikely that President Trump won't try to extract what he can. I think the new Mexican president in particular, has congratulated President-elect Trump. I think they're looking to work with him. But the question is, what's the ask going to be? He has threatened up to 200% tariffs if China doesn't help with migration issues in the past. He shows, at least in his rhetoric, very little concern about what the actual USMCA rules are. But the review does allow an exit from the agreement. So the threat point is real for Mexico. Mexican trade is still largely oriented toward the United States. So this is a very big issue for the US. I think one of the asks that we expect has to do with rules of origin. And here we get at what I think is a misunderstanding or misperception that I see even at very high levels, which is that USMCA comes with rules of origin on all types of goods. So I know we have a very sophisticated audience here today, but just for those of you who may not be familiar with rules of origin, this is about the content that's in any good that qualifies for free trade entry into the United States. So no tariffs into the United States. And we know that Mexico does have Chinese value added. So parts that it imports from China do go into things that are made in Mexico and then come across the border duty free. That's perfectly legitimate. I find myself having to say quite often, that's not cheating, because the media also often uses words like circumvention, or somehow words that mean that they're doing something that is not quite kosher. But in fact, that's perfectly fine. It happens all over the world. If the US decides to negotiate on rules of origin, including perhaps only China or maybe beyond China, I think we're in for a very difficult ride. And again, it goes to what I think is my greatest fear, which is the isolation of the US economy and real degradation, in US competitiveness, because we're unable to use inputs that are produced in the most cost-effective manner.
Right. So you mentioned retaliation, and I really want to hear your thoughts about that and the related topic, I guess, of negotiation. So there are some economists who would say, if somebody hits you with a tariff, don't retaliate because you're only punishing your own consumers. On the other hand, if you plan to bargain the tariff away, then you need to have a bargaining chip.
I mean, obviously, Michael, you're right on both counts. And I think it depends on the country and whether they see that there's any bargain forthcoming. So if we look at Europe, this would be a very big increase in aggression against Europe. I think it would be viewed by the Europeans as a real violation of what has been the spirit of the, arrangements since the end of World War II. I'd be surprised if President Trump actually goes ahead and levies these tariffs if the Europeans don't respond strongly. Why? Because here it's a repeated game. It's a game that's going to continue. It's a dynamic game. We're not going to do without Europe. Also because Europe has economies that are in some sense similar to ours, of course, not quite as diversified, but they're able to produce many of these products themselves or get them from alternative sources. When we turn to China, it's a different story. If President-elect Trump actually levies 60% tariffs on China, or goes a step further, as we now have some legislation being written to revoke permanent normal trade relations from China. China may simply decide the US is done with China, therefore we will be done with the US. And there would be some mild retaliation, perhaps on goods that the US is highly dependent on China, and we still are, an important thing to note. But then otherwise say, you know what, it's not worth our time. Our economy itself is in a tough patch. We need to focus on the domestic economy, the revival of domestic demand, and do what we've already been doing, which is cultivating alternative markets. So it is possible that we see a muted response from China, really for the reasons that you say, which is that they don't see this as part of a deal. Having said that, I think the Chinese are very ready to make a deal. They just, I think, don't have any idea of what it is that President Trump wants. They showed themselves willing to sign an agreement with, quite frankly, targets for purchases that everybody at the time knew were highly unrealistic and which never were borne out. Not surprising to anybody who actually looked at that agreement. And people wondered, why did the Chinese sign it? Maybe they had different forecasts of how many airplanes they were going to buy from Boeing. We don't know. But I think the Chinese would like to have a deal. I think given the rhetoric that we're hearing from the Trump administration, they're not feeling that a deal is on the table.
Hannah, what have you got for us?
Well, I have an observation, actually, more than this conversation is so fascinating. But there's one thing that's on my mind that keeps going over and over again. And that was back in September, we had a webinar where somebody had, how embarrassing, I don't have the name right here. But there's a webinar on the Iron Curtain. And they had estimated the effects of the Iron Curtain, which was, complete cutoff between East and West Germany. And that was estimated to be a tariff of 25%. So, I mean, these are unprecedented times, right? And 10% this way or that way. But 25% was a complete cutoff. And so 60%, 100%, 200%. I mean, this is not an auction. So I just wanted to just add that to the conversation, just in order to get, a sense of magnitude on that.
Yeah, I think that's why we may see the tariff levied in tranches. I've already mentioned that there are some very sensitive parts of this bundle where 60% would be a gigantic shock to the economic system and a negative shock, of course. So we may be seeing that. I'll also just say that we are really unable to, I think, really precisely or even carefully estimate what the effect on trade flows will be. We have a lot of nice evidence, very good, solid evidence that came from a lot of the academic economic work on the first trade war. But again, those elasticities, depending on which you choose, and of course here, it gets technical to use sort of the basic OLS or more complicated econometric techniques used to estimate. Some of those elasticities, or actually many of the ones that are estimated with the more sophisticated methods that most economists would espouse, show actually very, very severe decreases in US-China trade. So is it possible in a world where we have no trade between US and China? Most of us don't think so. They don't take into account the fact that China is the dominant producer in many goods categories, or not a dominant producer who produces 40-50% of the world's supply. We may just see a gigantic reorientation of those supplies. But I think you're right to note the magnitude, and that the size of this destabilizing shock may be something that we we'll be studying for years. I'll put a positive spin on that.
That actually reminds me to ask something that Ben had encouraged me to ask. We have got a lot of people on this call who are actually researchers who are trying to write papers and things. And in this environment, what do you think are some research topics that are generated by this huge natural experiment? You mentioned elasticities, and I agree with you that as tariff rates get high enough to where they approach being prohibitive, the functional forms change. And so there's all sorts of like wonderful geekery that can get people published around that. But
Or at least a PhD.
at the very least, a
Mhm.
PhD. And we've discussed what you do after you get your PhD and try to get your first paper published in here. But are there any other research topics that in this moment, if you knew somebody who was like had completed their orals and was looking for a topic that you might suggest to them?
Well, since I was a PhD advisor for over 30 years at Syracuse University, this is not an uncomfortable role for me. Look, we saw some very good work being done fairly quickly on the first trade war. So we would, and part of that is made possible by the free access to the microdata that comes out of the, US Census. So you can get access to very detailed trade flow data and look at what the various tariff rates are doing. The Trump administration is going to run a gigantic experiment. It was somewhat anticipated. We clearly are already seeing a pickup in trade flows, and we're going to see that continue now that the election has been decided. So we will see some anticipatory movements, but longer term, I think we know that this is going to have a negative effect on trade flows. I think that those elasticities will be important, but what we don't know as clearly is how supply chains are reorganizing. I think that's a very important area. Which countries are picking up the activity and what are the characteristics of those countries. Sorry. One of the things that I saw in my own work and that we saw from the work by Carolyn Freund and others is that countries that already were doing some bit of these activities were more likely to get the trade deflection. That makes sense if there's already factories there for people looking for subcontractors to find. It's easier to hook in. So that's one. How long it takes, how costly it is. These are all important questions, I think, for real world supply chain managers. What is the effect on large companies versus small and medium-sized companies? And what is the push toward more digital trade forms? What is the increase in corruption, frankly, in black marketeering? These are also very important questions, which I think we used to talk a lot about 20 years ago, but have really been ignored in the literature. And yet, obviously, with tariffs at this rate, it's ripe for corruption and for piracy. And I think that's also a good topic. So and I'm just, I think, really touching the surface of the types of things that we really need to study.
So that's actually a good one. And this has been one of the topics I've dabbled in over the years, that when you impose tariffs of this point, some shippers will simply say, I am going to lie massively about the valuation and avoid the tariff, or I'm going to lie about where the goods are coming from, bounce them off another country and put them in a box saying made in somewhere else. And there are wonderful research questions that can come from that. But I want to touch on one other possible motivation for the tariffs, which has been put forward by some members of the administration, which is that they want to negotiate something, that the Trump team believes in reciprocal trade, which was a word. Yeah. It's yeah. I'm trying to remain deadpan as well, because that was the language that Cordell Hull used in 1934 to mean the exact opposite of the Trump trade policy. But presuming that they actually do have in mind that they're trying to negotiate something, what might they be trying to negotiate? Are they happy with just paper agreements saying we promise to buy more natural gas, or is there something substantive that they might be trying to negotiate?
Well, again, these ideas are half formed, right? We don't know how they will be expressed in terms of executive orders or legislation. But I think the way that we have seen President-elect Trump talk about it and his entourage talk about it is line by line reciprocity. And again, it's not the kind of reciprocity that we talk about when we talk about reciprocity as being one of the pillars of the WTO. So that's their version of fair market access, is line by line. And I think they could very well be asking for that. At the same time, there's a lot of focus on countries with which the United States has a trade deficit. And there's talk about special surcharges on investment flows, a desire to, decrease the value of the dollar on international markets. So there's a lot of pieces that go with this, and how this actually gets expressed in terms of executive orders or legislation, I think is really unknown. I think when we think that he has 4 years to act, and of course, as we saw in the last time, there's other things which can come on the radar, like last time, unfortunately, we saw with COVID-19 that divert attention from the trade area. If we take a 2-year perspective, I think there's only so much that can be done. And I think tariffs are going to clearly be the first tool that they reach for. On other types of tools, I think that we'll see folks on Wall Street, folks who are involved with tech trade flows, weighing in heavily against such unorthodox types of policies.
Right. So you mentioned the trade deficit, and I've been trying to puzzle that one out, because as economists, we can all sort of sit here and say, actually, trade deficit is a sign that you're healthy. A, B, you can't reduce the trade deficit. You didn't do it last time. But suppose that that's your belief, that your policy is that you're trying to reduce the trade deficit, and that after China, your priorities for the rest of the world are that you want to raise tariffs on countries that have most trade deficits. I was trying then to imagine that if I'm in the Trump administration and advising them, and I run the data, and I'm reminded that the United States runs trade deficits with practically everybody on the planet for structural reasons. And then what is it? Does it reduce to stereotyping that it's like, oh, Korea and Vietnam and the EU look deficit-ish, and we're mad at them, and we do them first, but maybe we haven't looked up the data for Canada, so we leave them alone? What do you think here?
Well, this is going to have to be selective if this is the route they go. And, we're clearly out in, the forest here, because this hasn't been done. It doesn't make much sense from an economic perspective. I think it clearly will be part of the justification for the tariffs on China, as it has been all along. Once we start using tariffs as a weapon to close bilateral deficits, we're clearly way away from any WTO obligations that we have. So we're already, again, I see the U.S. Moving to revoke permanent normal trade relations with China, but it's really we'll be doing it with the world in that case. There won't need to be there won't be any need to close the office in Geneva because it will effectively be closed. So, this is on a case-by-case basis, yes. And I think in some cases, they will really act at cross purposes to what are their own objectives. Let's take the case of South Korea. Has a trade surplus with the United States, but a lot of that surplus is due to the fact that their companies have invested heavily in response to the CHIPS Act and the IRA, and a lot of those flows are machinery that's coming into the United States. South Korea, following Chinese threatened export constraints on urea, which is essential for the operation of their diesel engines. Korea saw this weaponization of trade as an existential threat and has moved to diversify away from China. So here you have a close security partner in the United States, which is doing exactly what the U.S. is asked it to do, which is reducing its interaction with China on the one hand, and B, investing more in the United States. And then you're going to turn around and hit it with tariffs because it has a trade surplus with the U.S. This doesn't make any sense. And I mean, on the basis of no logic, how do you decide what the administration would do?
Indeed. And I'm having a hard time trying to decide on, like, yeah, how I would give advice to people based on rumors on what somebody had for breakfast. Ben, I know that we're running up against the limit. Is there are there one or two nuggets from the chat that you'd like to bring up while we still have time?
Yeah, I think one question that's come up. So we've done we had a session, as Hannah mentioned. So Benedict Hyde, Hannah put in the chat, was the researcher presenting this on kind of trade blocks and geopolitical tensions. And we saw the World Trade Organization in their World Trade Report this was it this year or last year? They did a big thing on geopolitical trading blocks. I'm old enough to remember reading about this stuff the last time it came around, when we were talking about Asian blocks and the North American bloc and all this sort of thing. Is there a certain sense in which we might be headed back to that kind of an arrangement? Sort of, the friendly sort of picture that people tried to paint of things like friendshoring, which we were talking about a year or two ago. Does all of that get ramped up to, as you're saying, to this kind of absurd degree under the next administration? And then, of course, other countries respond in the same way. Is that something we should be scared of, or is that simply so far down the road that, we should concentrate on what's in front of us at the moment?
Well, that's a big question. I think that this administration has not really shown itself to be interested in so-called friendshoring. It's not a word that you hear on the campaign trail. They're interested in reshoring. And as we all know, friendshoring was I would argue, reluctantly embraced by the Biden administration, weakly embraced, such that IPEF may simply float away. But we all understood the economic logic, which is that the United States can't produce everything, and it can't produce everything and remain competitive as a global exporter. So the need for it remains, but we haven't heard any embrace of it. In fact, friendshoring to many people's ears equals not U.S. jobs, and so they stay away from it. So that's one part. On terms of like regionalization or blocks, there's a lot of dimensions. Many of the papers that you mentioned use UN voting patterns. I don't think that adequately, if you look at the countries that are sorted into these groups, they don't really adequately assess the reliance on US, I think, for not just economic relations, but also security umbrella. And here we may see splits even within what's often called the Asian Production Network, which is that you may see, Japan and South Korea going one way, ASEAN clearly going another. ASEAN's relationship with China has deepened. They are, of course, the part of RCEP. RCEP, really flowing originally from ASEAN initiatives. So I don't think we're seeing coherent or completely aligned interests, even within Asia. In the US, and you're going to see a lot of division with our partner to the south, Mexico, if we begin to try to use our access to our market as a form of extortion. And we've already seen Latin America become the site of a lot of Chinese investment. And I think that it's not going to be possible to put the world into nice, neat little blocks.
And you must also be crazy about this, right? They're not even talking about services. Like this whole trade deficit, and there's no services. You must be mad, right? The services is your thing, Ben.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, if we had more than a minute left, we could get into the services side of this. But yeah, it is striking, right, that an economy like the US, which is mostly services, we're hung up on some particular bits of manufacturing. So yeah, I think there's that goes and comes around over different historical cycles, but that is definitely here at the moment. The moral for me is that I need to go and talk about services to people who really want to hear about it, which is in low and middle income countries now. But listen, Mary, thank you so much
You're welcome.
for sharing your time and really such deep expertise and experience with us today. I really learned a lot out of it. I'm sure that's true for everyone in the audience as well. And I'm particularly grateful that you were willing to, put the PhD advisor hat back on and give us some research ideas. So, some of those will be taken up because people out there are very hungry for these sorts of ideas. And, you're right to highlight that, the glass half full kind of view as an economist out of the first trade war was that we actually got some great research and we learned some really important things on, on the values of these elasticities, things like pass-through. There were some advances in modeling technology, all this kind of stuff. So again, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Michael, thank you for being a fantastic moderator and chair. Really great questions, right on point. And I think it was a really great session. Hannah.
Yes, I have one thing left to say apart from, of course, thank you, Mary. We have wanted to have you on for a long time, and we are going to have you back for the PhD thing, obviously, now that we opened that can. And thank you, Michael. But for everybody who's listening, I just wanted to make a pitch for something that's coming out tomorrow, I think. So the Trade Experts are doing a fantastic project with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And we will be opening a call for people who want to come to Brussels to talk about regulations. So they will be talking to policymakers, parliaments, think tanks, and all sorts of interesting people about the effects on third countries on trade, on EU regulations. And so I'm going to make sure that I post that in the TPR forum group on LinkedIn. But we want some really, really awesome people who usually don't get access to Brussels to join us there. And all expenses are paid. So I think it's going to be an amazing opportunity. It's going to be in the beginning of February. So please keep an eye out for that. And also, Ben, this year, we're going to skip our webinar in December, and we're going to go straight into January. And then we have Emmanuel Orcon, and we have DDG Johanna Hill, who are going to come talk to us about the importance of digital trade for development.
Absolutely. That's going to be a great webinar as well. So that's on January the 23rd. And of course, we will market it in all our usual ways beforehand. So Hannah, thanks for being a great partner in all of this. Mary, thank you again for sharing your time and expertise with us. We really appreciate it. Michael, thanks for being a great moderator and a great advisor to the forum. We appreciate it all. All the best to everyone for the end of year holidays, for those celebrating, and we'll see you back in this space in January.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank
Mary.
you.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.